Gilio-Whitaker, Greetings, my relatives. I am a descendant from the Lakes Band of Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State, and I am a research associate and associate scholar at the Center for World Indigenous Studies. And this project started out as a research paper. We do a lot of research there. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But it started out as a research paper that developed into a fairly large project. And what I'm going to show you here is just an excerpt, a small extract from that project that was recently chosen to be included in the forthcoming book called Handbook on Indigenous Knowledge and Research Methodologies in Developing Nations. And I present this paper also on behalf of my colleagues that I co-authored this paper with Dr. Rudy Reeser and Heidi Bruce, who I'm sorry couldn't be here with me today. Let's see here. Okay, so Fourth World Theory has its origins in Secwepemc First Nations Chief George Manuel book that he wrote in 1974 that's called The Fourth World and Indian Reality. And that, of course, was at the height of the Indian sovereignty movements in the United States and Canada. In the book, Manuel emphasized that there was a difference between nations and states, and that nations are actually nations and states are in relationships to each other in larger geopolitical processes. You can see this is going to go in a slightly different direction than what we've been hearing, but it's related, and we'll see why. In Fourth World Theory, one of the salient parts of it is that it bridges international relations and indigenous studies. And for me personally, it's really important because as I was a graduate student and undergraduate student, I struggled to find a language. I was doing a lot of research with regard to like international indigenous issues, and there was no language for it, and I never had been exposed to Fourth World Theory until after I was at and working with the Center for World Indigenous Studies, which is why this is so important to me, and I think to everybody doing indigenous studies. Fourth World Theory emphasizes the international political character of Fourth World nations, and it does so by denaturalizing the modern state system, which of course we know is only a few hundred years old, dating back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It emphasizes the political self-determination of nations far older than 500 years, meaning that if we think in terms of colonialism here in the Americas and settler colonialism, we think of it starting with Columbus in 1492, but really colonization has been going on a lot longer than that in nations and other continents in Europe, Asia, and pretty much every other continent in the world is peopled. It takes cultural context, or takes nationhood into the context of culture and the geopolitical neoliberal world order that we currently find ourselves in. Fourth World theorists, as written by Bruce Jans at the University of Central Florida, who said that Fourth World theorists draw from hermeneutic philosophy, literary and artistic philosophy, nationalistic and ideological philosophy, sage philosophy, and ethno-philosophy. The Center for World Indigenous Studies was established in 1979 to aid Fourth World nations in their research, policy, and education projects, engaging a Fourth World theoretical perspective. And it's been building ever since then, this body of work that we call Fourth World Theory. In this project, we talk about Fourth World Theory in three broad categories, those being epistemology, pedagogy, and geopolitics. Epistemology emphasizes, as we all know, non-hierarchical, non-linear relationships between humans and nature. And as Greg Cajete from the University of New Mexico has written what he called the metaphorical mind, indigenous peoples, fourth world peoples think metaphorically. And we like to think of the spiral as a metaphor that's really common to most indigenous and fourth world nations. I actually saw that in a presentation earlier. I was in a panel on Hawaiian topics, and somebody else brought the metaphor of the spiral in. I thought that was a really nice coincidence. And so I just included all the ways that spirals show up in nature, right? That our ancestors and indigenous peoples all over the world are inspired by. And I particularly like this one because it emphasizes the multidimensionality of the spiral. And it really brings into our conscious awareness the infinite nature of the spiral in moving in all directions and all dimensions. So epistemologically, there's many commonalities across fourth world nations, and this we like to use the example of the Hopi and Mayan prophecies, which describe the evolving state of the human condition having emerged through four creations, like the Hopi talk about the four worlds, right? And the metaphor of the four directions, of course, is probably the most recognizable maybe of all indigenous epistemological thought. And the fourth world, which, going back to Hopi, the Hopi say that we are now living in the fourth world. Some valid methods of inquiry include dreaming, weighting, comparing multiple variable relationships, counting, watching, stressing, as in physical stress, visioning, hallucinogens, as in sacred plants, medicines, analogical reasoning, and relational reasoning. Some of the these next few images will show the ubiquity of the four directions symbology. This one comes from the Andes, and it depicts the four directions in terms of a cycle. This comes from a wall somewhere in the Andes, a stone wall. This one comes from the Columbia Gorge. These are all, of course, rock art, right? That's ubiquitous all over North America. Costa Rica, also more commonly known as the Huichols in West Mexico. Looks like some traditional offerings to a place that's recognized as sacred. Of course, the Lakota Four Directions is very well known here to us in North America. The Mexica also have their depiction of the four directions in a really elaborate illustration here. The Anishinaabe medicine wheel, very similar to the Lakota, and this one I love because it shows the multiple level, the multiple meanings, of the symbology with regard to colors and characteristics of life, where we are, the phases of life that we go through as humans, and animals, and plants, and elements, and how it just ties everything together in a holistic system. Some indigenous knowledge systems that the Center for World Indigenous Studies has produced extensive research on and work with include the Anahuac system of the Toltec, the Anishinaabe Ndudamok, as Keith just talked about. I heard you mention that. And the Sawak theory of the Nuchalna, which was a book written by Richard Atleo, aka Unique, in 2004. Anybody interested in indigenous epistemologies really should read this book. It's remarkable. in terms of pedagogy, fourth world theory is applicable because, and important because it serves as a conceptual container or a language. It gives us a language to talk about fourth world learning approaches. And because there are so many different fourth world nations, fourth world peoples, there are so many fourth world epistemologies. In other words, there is no one universal, even though there's common threads that go through many fourth world nations, like we just saw. There's an epistemology virtually for every fourth world nation that we can name. Most of us might be familiar with the concept of red pedagogy, as written about by Sandy Grand, where she writes that critical pedagogies which are pretty forward thinking in larger pedagogical terms, but she says that they're inadequate for native peoples because of their focus on economic parity, and they're unable to accommodate indigenous epistemologies. So in a fourth world theoretical framework, learning is based in experiential knowledge, just like we've been seeing. I mean, we've seen excellent examples of that here on this panel. So experiential knowledge, worldviews, and cultures that are not just rational, but they're relational, and not just relational, but rational. Some valid methods of inquiry include group discovery, observation, practice, again, relational reasoning, trial and error, mirroring and shadowing, oral traditions, ceremonies, and institutional structures that would be political, religious, and social. Okay, in the realms of geopolitical engagement, this is, in our work at the Center for World Indigenous Studies, this is probably how we engage fourth world theory the most, because we work on the level of government with indigenous nations. And again, we, like George Manuel wrote about in The Fourth World and Indian Reality, we recognize that nations are far older than states, and there's this distinction here that that's based on the fact that what we've identified is that there are more than 6,000 bedrock nations in the world still existing. And that's a lot more than 370 million indigenous peoples that the United Nations, gives as its official number. 6,000 bedrock nations really comes out to be more like, probably a sixth of the world's population, world's people. In this framework, in this distinction between nations and states, we believe that the terms are used incorrectly, where, in popular dialogue, you'll hear the term nation applied to, say, France or Germany, the nation Germany, but those are really states. That's a legal creation that was created as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia, right? So, and in that sense, states can never become nations. Nations are people, or communities, collectivities of people with long relationships to place. And within states, you'll have nations that do that, but nations can become states, but states can never become nations. Dr. Reeser, in his book Indigenous Nations and Modern States, identified, did an analysis of the most common conflicts in the world in the 20th century, and discovered that most of the conflicts in the world today are between nations and states, not between states. So, and those usually get referred to as civil wars, but of course what that does is it reifies the state as the natural form of organization, political organization. Fourth world theory, it compels us to rethink indigeneity. And we always like to say, indigenous peoples are more than just little brown people. And because we're reconceptualizing what indigeneity is, it's a deracializing project. So it deracializes fourth world peoples by emphasizing the political character of their nations. There are several, we talk about political status, there are, in this framework there are, and we can see the emergence of, as empires break down in the 20th century, we see emergences of different types of new political statuses that are beyond and other than the state. We see integrated nations. They all have varying levels of sovereignty that are internally and externally. Greenland and Nunavut are good examples of integrated nations that have, they're fully integrated into the state and have very little outside sovereignty. Autonomous nations have a slightly greater degree of sovereignty. Their governance is delegated. Some of the examples that you see here are in Burgundy, it's a region in France. In Zulu, South Africa, these people live mostly in the KwaZulu-Natal province. And Yaktitazba in Nicaragua, which of course was the Contra War in the 80s, that involved the Mosquito, Sumo, Rama, and Creole peoples, and eventually negotiated greater sovereign autonomy arrangements. In associated nations, we have a greater degree of sovereignty yet. We see many Native American nations in this country, the Sami, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, even Corsica, France, have similar associated nation status. And independently federated nations, they have internal inherent government, agree of negotiated external and internal sovereignty, they have government-to-government relations, and substantial economic self-sufficiency. Catalonia, Spain is a great example. It's one of 17 autonomous provinces in the state of Spain, and they are possibly on the verge of secession from the state, just as Scotland. Scotland recently went through an independence vote. It failed, but still similar situation. Kurdistan and Baluchistan in the Middle East also share these characteristics of independently federated nations. And finally, independent nation states. These are nations that have achieved independence and have become states. So these are true nation states because of their longevity as nations, as peoples. Some of the best examples are the Federated States of Micronesia, which gained their independence from the U.S. in 1986. Andorra has been a state. I mean, it goes back at least to 1200 and is now considered a microstate. It's situated between Spain and France. And the island nation of Vanuatu just regained its independence from France in 1980, and all three of these examples are United Nations member states. So in conclusion, I wanted to just quote Chief George Manuel, who wrote that once the fourth world enters the historical consciousness of the globe, it arguably beacons the most dramatic history of transculturation ever witnessed.